The internet of the 1800s wasn't easy to repair, but it was easy to troubleshoot. The wire was pretty much always the problem. The telegraph devices just sat indoors all day and did their thing. You'd need to replace the ink or the paper or the battery once in a while, but the devices themselves mechanically failing was relatively rare. The wire, meanwhile, was often a completely uninsulated bare copper wire, typically strung along a series of poles. It was exposed to the weather and the sun in spots it would have to contend with low tree branches. Some telegraph lines navigated the wilderness. They might be cut down by thieves or saboteurs or bored kids with nothing else to do. During the Civil War, cutting the enemy's lines was a tried and true military tactic. With a sprawl of dozens of thousands of miles, it was just too much to keep track of, too many places where it could go wrong. Nearly 150 years later, I had a job doing over-the-phone tech support for an internet service provider. Maybe you called in and talked to me, who knows? I found that a lot of people who called in were still under the impression that the wire, the cable, was the problem. It certainly could be, but it's not that common. In my experience, it was most likely your router. This is something that understandably required me to do some convincing. You didn't usually believe me. The cable's out there being rained on and getting chopped up by weed whackers. The router's just been sitting there. You haven't been messing with it at all. How could it be the router? These days, your provider will often issue you a modem-router combo that usually works pretty well, but in 2006, it was far more common to have two separate devices, the modem and the router. The cable modem was the Al Borland of this relationship. It would read signals from what was typically RG6 cable, a World War II-era holdover that was previously intended to transmit analog cable TV before there was an internet and before anyone knew there would be an internet as we know it today. But it was the type of cable that was already there, uncoiling through neighborhoods and snaking through your walls, and the modem was what made it all possible. This modem would perform the heroic work of pulling analog signals out of this ancient cable, translating it to digital signal, and passing it along to your computer or network. And of course, it would do the reverse when you sent data upstream. This is incredibly impressive work, and it did so moment to moment, day after day, without ever missing a beat. You often only needed to power cycle it, in other words, unplug it and plug it back in, maybe a couple times a year. It was the greatest. Once the modem did all the truly hard work, it passed out its fresh out of the oven digital signal to your router. The router was the TIM. Unreliable, forgetful, negligent. All it had to do was shoot the data a few more feet, but despite having the easy job, it might stop working and need a power cycle every few days, even every few hours. I still don't know what its deal was, but like Tim, who tried to offset his ineptitude with grunts and one-liners and retrofitted monstrosities, these things sure did try to compensate. While the modem was always a completely unassuming black box that looked like it could have been manufactured in 1986, the router often sprouted these big, blocky antennas that made it look like a dead, belly-up robotic insect. As if the transmission strength was ever the issue. As if what we were really missing here was more power. One day I got a call that perfectly intersected this dynamic with the new wave of home improvement America experienced in the 90s and aughts, one that I believe was juiced in some limited respect by shows like This Old House and, yeah, Home Improvement. This guy was pretty friendly, which, despite everything you hear, most callers were. His internet wasn't working, so I checked the upstream and downstream readings on the line, asked him to tell me what the lights on the modem were doing, helped him check his IP address, all the basic stuff, until, as usual, I was convinced this was a router problem. So I asked him to unplug his router and plug it back in, and he said, "I can't." "Oh, I got you. No problem. Do you happen to have somebody nearby who can help?" "No," he said. "I literally can't." Turns out, during a recent fit of home improvement, he'd put up new drywall in his living room, and he had decided to place his modem and wireless router between the studs and wall it off behind the drywall, powering them via an electrical socket that was also behind the drywall. He treated his network like it was plumbing, never imagining he'd ever have to look at it again. We had a good laugh about it. He probably had a fun day hacking up his new wall with a hammer, but I understand where the instinct comes from. We think of these devices and these wires as unsightly, and we hide them from our sight whenever possible. We even use those goofy wireless phone chargers that don't even eliminate the wire from the charger to the wall socket, they just keep us from having to touch the wire. We want everything to be wireless, invisible magic. But you know, the thing we are walling off is our most expansive masterwork. It is the greatest superstructure humankind has ever created. quite literally the only global superstructure, and one that is nearly 200 years old. We're about to meet an Al Borland, if there ever was one, a man named Frederick Gisborne, who, in 1851, is hacking his way through the wilderness of Newfoundland. And what I would like to argue is that the line he is preparing to crudely string across this island in the year 1851 and the cable sticking out of your living room wall right now are the same thing. I don't mean that they're similar or that they're different versions of the same thing. I mean that they are the same thing. Fiber optic cable is increasingly becoming the norm for our big, huge telecommunications superstructure, but obviously it's not replaced all at once. It's gradual and piecemeal, and along the way, fiber optic cables regularly communicate with older RG cable. When cable internet was the cutting edge, those cables regularly communicated with phone lines that supplied dial-up internet, and before that, exclusively phone calls. Around the turn of the century, as the telephone began to replace the telegraph, old telegraph lines were kept in place and repurposed as telephone lines, sharing the very same physically connected network with the telegraph. The entire time, this network has remained physically intact. This means that our global telecommunications network is a ship of Theseus, a thing that certainly retains none of the physical materials that it was made of when they began building it in the 1840s and 50s, but has nonetheless been augmented so gradually that it has never stopped being, at its core, the same thing. So, when you hear about Frederick Gisborne and his First Nation companions working on the line in 1851, know that they are among the people who are working on your line. Their estimated arrival time is 1850 through 1866 between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Thank you for your patience. I'll be honest with you, I began my research of Frederick Gisborne thinking how funny it would be if he actually wore flannel, not at all expecting to find evidence of that. And then, on page 26 of his journal, what do you know? He's a flannel man. Gisborne is a classic Al Borland. Visually, he's a dead ringer, big, bearded, strapping. Although he's in his 20s, he commands the respect of a much older man. Now, our previous Al saw his inventions stolen by his Tim.
Name one creative thing I ever did on Tool Time.
Well, Gadget Corner?
That was your idea?
No, I just took credit for it.
Al, like the rest of the supporting cast of Home Improvement, was almost never allowed to have his own thing going on. This Season 5 episode might be the first time we ever get to see him strike out on his own without Tim.
What about that Tool Time game you designed?
Yeah. Everybody else loved my Tool Time board game.
Al's been dreaming about that project for years. To this point, pretty much everything bad that's ever happened to him could be explained by the presence of Tim, so you want to think that Tim was always the problem, was always the one holding Al back. But we know better than that because, again, the show's point of view is Tim's point of view. This is Tim's world, one in which Al is often fated to suffer.
Al is going to make a fortune on this.
In order to mass produce the game, Al hired contractors whose shoddy wiring causes every copy of the game to set itself on fire. The problem isn't that he's Al, it's that nobody else is Al. This Al is having contractor troubles of his own. Frederick Gisborne is leading an expedition to survey a path for a new telegraph line through Newfoundland. On the evening of October 17th, 1851, somewhere around this patch of land, while his hired men set up camp and kick off their boots for the day, Al ventures off just a bit to find some higher terrain and have a look around. This is one of the least inviting pieces of land on the planet, whether you're a human, an animal, or even a plant. The island was totally covered in an ice sheet until about 10,000 years ago, and being an island, many species of flora and fauna couldn't migrate to it when the ice age ended. No raccoons, no snakes, no lots of stuff you'd think you'd see. There is St. John's, a somewhat small port city on the eastern coast, and some small populations of First Nations people who mostly stick to the coast as well. Inland, it can be kind of a nightmare. Bleak is the word he uses. He's worried that his men, who aren't as seasoned and experienced in the wildernesses of the world as he is, might die out here. So he cuts them loose and hires some men from the Mi'kmaq tribe who know the land and are far better suited for this expedition. They become fast friends, teaching each other dances, doing gymnastic exercises, laughing, joking, arguing over where thunder comes from. You know, dude stuff. Gisborne learns that they've found silver on the island, and knowing that his journal will probably be widely circulated one day, he makes sure to log in detail that the Mi'kmaq people should reap its benefits. One Mi'kmaq companion is impressed with his resilience throughout this journey, bestowing upon him the esteemed title of Crazy White Boy. Friendship is all they got. This expedition is a nightmare. Gisborne uses the word miserable a half dozen times in his 35-page journal. He quickly realizes the maps made of Newfoundland are all wrong and offers the following advice. Don't come here. You'll probably die. Throughout nearly the entire month of October, torrential rain drops all over them. At night, the tent floods, so they have to cut a hole in the bottom so they don't sleep soaking in a pool of cold water. Gisborne's boots are perpetually waterlogged, and his clothes are so soaked around the clock that they're chafing his skin and he's bleeding all over his body. It's impossible to keep anything less than soaking wet, so the bread they're carrying turns into mush. They try to keep their food and clothes dry as well as they can, but it takes 90 minutes to start a fire, then several more hours for the fire to dry everything out. By that time, they've spent almost all their daylight. So sometimes they resolve to just march through the pouring rain and, at least in one case, a hailstorm. Once they've marched like that to the point of exhaustion, they sleep under a blanket that obviously is soaking wet. They do this night after night. Sometimes it snows so hard that the tops of their sleeping bodies are flush with the surface of the snow, and then it rains. Once it becomes clear that the rain will not end, their souls are defeated. Gisborne asks his companions if they want to give up. A couple do take him up on it. One of them, who goes by the name Joe, tells him, "I can't do it. I can't go down in history as the guy who gave up before the white guy." Both Joe and Gisborne managed to survive the journey. It's been reported that another Mi'kmaq man died along the way. If he did, of course, rest in peace, but I suspect this might have been a misinterpretation. Gisborne's journal was so personal and detailed and communicated such strong kinship with his companions that the death of one of them absolutely would have been written about at length in his journal, but there's nothing. All I found was this entry from October 21st in which he says Matthew Brazil drank too much rum and, quote, rolled over dead drunk. They left him there, which I take to mean he just had a really bad hangover and never bothered to join back up with the group. Anyway, by the time they double back and return to St. John's, Gisborne does so with a known route through which a telegraph line can be run through Newfoundland. He's planned on doing so with the help of some investment partners, but two of those partners start fighting. Both of them quit and take their money with them, and all of a sudden Gisborne is left holding the bag. He's arrested for debt and briefly thrown in jail, although he's so universally well-liked and respected in the Maritimes that he soon sprung loose. Still though, Frederick Gisborne almost died out there. He endured months of sleeping in the rain, nearly starving, nearly freezing to death. He's lost all his money, he's been locked up. And for what? If laying telegraph line is his trade, there are plenty of better, safer places to do that where roadways and civilization actually exist. Newfoundland is not exactly a major industrial or commercial hub. It's one real city. St. John's is not exactly a big city, and it's nowhere near any other major cities. And Gisborne, who was born in England and has lived all over the world, isn't even from Newfoundland. Why a telegraph line? Why here? What exactly is the point? That's right. They've been very clear about this. They've told Frederick Gisborne this is impossible. When he gets back from Newfoundland, he proposes it again, and they tell him it's impossible again. You cannot pull a telegraph wire across the Atlantic Ocean. If you did, you would establish proof of concept that a truly worldwide telecommunications network can be built in the 1850s, but you can't. Gisborne remains determined. He surveyed this tract to the eastern coast of Newfoundland so that a transatlantic underwater telegraph line can be laid on the ocean floor between here and the southwestern coast of Ireland. You're probably already imagining all the reasons this is impossible at this point in history, but for one, Newfoundland hasn't even been wired to the North American mainland yet. Can it be? Can an underwater telegraph line work? Well, there's some conditional good news to report there. Obviously, you can't just run bare copper wire across the ocean floor, so it'll need insulation, and it's at this point that we need to stop calling it a wire and start calling it a cable. At this point, the technology to develop synthetic insulation materials doesn't yet exist. there is one, and only one, known substance on Earth that can act as an effective insulator. It's called gutta-percha, and it's a sort of tar-like substance that's highly moldable in hot water but becomes really tough and resilient once it's cooled down. In the 19th century, its applications are many. This bottle is made of gutta-percha. These golf balls are made of gutta-percha. This cane that Preston Brooks is using to beat Charles Sumner is made of gutta-percha. Of greatest interest to telegraphers, though, is that it presents a very high dielectric strength, meaning it can withstand a reasonable amount of electric current without breaking down or leaking that current. Gutta-percha is the only known material on the planet that offers these properties in this measure, and wouldn't you know it, the one place on Earth it can be found falls within the confines of the British Empire, which immediately starts doing what empires do. In Malaysia, gutta-percha trees produce a considerable amount of the substance, but the vast majority of it is too difficult to actually extract. In a paper published in 2009, John Tully explains that when they cut down a fully grown 60-foot tall tree, they could only actually harvest an average of about 11 ounces from it. In other words, crack open a can of soda and take a swig. However much you have left is how much they get out of a 60-foot tree. There is, of course, way more gutta-percha than that in the tree, but they can't figure out how to get it out. So after chopping it down, they just leave it there and move on to the next tree. It was such a crude way of going about it that it eventually took on the term slaughter tapping. Tully estimates that by the end of the 19th century, they had to knock down about 88 million trees to get all the insulation they needed for underwater cables around the world, most of which came from ecologically invaluable rainforests. The gutta-percha tree almost went extinct entirely because all the while, very few people involved even raised the question of sustainability. But this is one of those times a chapter of history ends like sitcoms do. It's crucial to the long-term prospect of a sitcom that its characters never learn anything because their quirks and shortcomings are what make them funny. It's why you see the Toolman make the same mistakes in his marriage over and over and over again. Every new episode, he relives some variant of the same day and presents the same failings, but it doesn't matter. In a very similar fashion, the captains of industry that nearly drove the gutta-percha tree out of existence were bailed out by pure happenstance. It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that they started to come to terms with the fact that they were completely running out. In 1902, it was reported that gutta-percha trees could barely even be found in the wild anymore. Can you guess what happened a couple months prior to that? Marconi had achieved transatlantic wireless radio transmission, which would dramatically lessen the demand for gutta-percha. It was a classic Deus Ex Machina, a new technology that just happened to arrive just in time to bail us out, leaving us free to repeat the same episode and devastate rainforests over and over again. Somehow, season after season, our great shared human sitcom remains on the air. But back to the 1850s, when people are decades away from caring about any of that, a lot of important lessons are being learned in the field of undersea telegraphy after some very Tool-Time-esque series of trials and errors. The idea they've landed on is to coil up a ton of cable in the hold of a ship and throw it out of the stern as it sails along. This is a very intricate process. For one, the ship can't go too fast, a grievous error committed by Tim later in the show's run when he accidentally flips on the thrusters of an F-14 Tomcat engine and sends the USS Constellation supercarrier flying across the ocean at 900 knots or whatever. I'm not much of a fan of Home Improvement's late-era stunts where they kept trying to up the ante like this. I'm a much bigger fan of the simple slapstick Home Improvement offered, which it really should be commended for. Here, a glaringly obvious Tim Allen stunt double demonstrates the other lesson that Telegraph pioneers are now learning. You gotta remember to let go. While trying to lay a cable from Scotland to Ireland, the steam paddler Britannia learned both these lessons the hard way. It went too fast for her men to be able to put any slack on the line, and it didn't let go, yanking all the expensive instruments and equipment out of the telegraph station, clanking across the beach and into the sea. The bad news is that once they actually do lay the cable and bring it to the other end, the problems are only beginning. In 1850, a cable is dropped across the English Channel, the first time this has ever been pulled off. Those on the French end of the wire excitedly hook it up to their instruments to receive Morse code signals from the British, only to find out that they're completely jumbled up and unintelligible. Same deal for those in England trying to pick up signals from the French. Both sides suspect the other of over-celebrating and getting so drunk off their asses that they can't type straight. During these years, telegraph companies all over the world are running into this same problem. Despite the gutta-percha insulation, signals just don't behave the same way underwater as they do above ground. The further a signal travels down the line, the more it slows down, and nobody knows why. In 1855, for example, an underwater cable is laid across a stretch of the Black Sea. It's the longest undersea cable ever attempted to this point, and despite all its insulation, they have to slow down transmission to just 5 words per minute in order to keep it the least bit intelligible. For example's sake, all the words I've spoken over the last 10 minutes would take more than 6 hours to transmit over this line. And that's for a line stretching about 300 miles. A transatlantic cable would span close to 2,000 miles. How much worse is this going to get on a cable 6 or 7 times as long? Do we have an answer for that? Doesn't matter. People have caught the bug. We've gotten a taste of the experience of instantly receiving a 1,000-word message sent from over 1,000 miles away, and we cannot get enough. We're talking about belting the globe. We're talking about time and distance utterly annihilated. We're imagining a future in which we can extend telegraph lines to other planets, which to me is a really funny illustration of how limited our imaginations were prior to the advent of wireless radio. But for now, we've got telegraph fever, and we don't really have time for questions like, why is underwater cable behaving differently? What we need now is a man untethered by the concerns of science, a man liberated from the oppressive confines of knowledge. We need a Tim. In January of 1854, Frederick Gisborne is introduced to business magnate Cyrus W. Field. Field is slight of frame, especially standing next to Gisborne. His defining characteristic, which sometimes actually can be more of a virtue than a vice, is his minute-to-minute restlessness. Always scheming, planning, making moves. He does not and cannot chill. An instructive piece of tool time lore is that while Al Borland did a lot of construction work during his time in the Navy and operated a crane as a union man, Tim started out as a salesman for Binford Tools, tool time sponsor, which might explain the otherwise odd choice to wear a necktie on a home improvement show. Cyrus Field has come up as a businessman as well, having gotten rich in the paper business without more than a passing interest at best in the field of telegraphy. In a biography of Field written by his daughter, there is almost no mention of the word telegraph until the part that describes this meeting between him and Gisborne. And it's here that I'm going to make another break with the commonly accepted historical record, not because proposing alternate histories is fun, which it is, but because this just does not add up. The story you're still most likely to hear is this one. Gisborne walked into Field's office not to propose a transatlantic cable, but to propose connecting Newfoundland to mainland North America so that messages could be telegraphed to St. John's, written down, loaded on a ship, and sailed to Europe, thereby getting there maybe a day or two faster than if they were sent from a place like New York City. The story goes that Field wasn't all that interested in this idea, but after Gisborne left, he looked at a globe he kept in his office. And what we're supposed to believe is that Field, upon examining the globe, experienced a fit of genius, an epiphany he arrived at completely independently that a cable should be laid straight across the Atlantic Ocean instead. I don't buy this for a couple of reasons. One is that several sources plainly state that Gisborne came to Nova Scotia politician Joseph Howe with the transatlantic proposal years earlier in 1850. Howe is the guy who shot him down multiple times in the first place. However, Howe is also the guy who later wrote a letter to Gisborne in which he said, "Listen, you were the first person who I ever heard propose the idea of a transatlantic cable. It was your idea. You have a much greater place in history than everyone thinks you do, and you should let everybody know it." Even beyond that though, are we really supposed to believe this? And nobody ever seriously considered the idea of a transatlantic cable until this random rich guy looked at a globe? It's amazing to me that something this silly is actually stuck. Any 5-year-old could look at a globe, point at the blue stuff, and say, make that part go beep beep. And listen, while I do think Frederick Gisborne might have been the first person to throw significant time and capital into the quest to build a transatlantic cable, neither he nor Field were the first to come up with the idea. Morse had floated the idea as far back as 1843, and I don't even think he was the first. Myth-making is undeniably fun, but I gotta ask that we try a little bit harder than this. Speaking of trying hard, Field was all in on everything he ever did, including, I think, the perpetuation of this myth. This is one of several photos of him posing with a globe. We've heard the globe story, man. We get it. We all get it. For a time, this incarnation of Tim and Al actually does get along pretty well. Shortly after their meeting, Cyrus Field forms what will eventually be known as the Atlantic Telegraph Company. In other words, our Binford Tools. This company ponies up the funds to get cable laid across Newfoundland and to lay an underwater cable connecting Newfoundland to Nova Scotia. Frederick Gisborne, the master architect of this plan, immediately goes on a long vacation, which is understandable given everything he's been through. In his absence, the project totally goes belly up and is on the verge of failure. In 1856, Field & Company finally convince him to come back, and Gisborne, being Gisborne, completely turns things around and gets both cables laid down successfully. And then, Gisborne leaves again, this time for good. One account says his relationship with Field and the other sours. Another claims that Field is starting to go around making and promoting plans without him. A third source seems to corroborate that. Further details seem to have been lost to history. Although Gisborne is no stranger to the world of business, these are two very different personalities. Field, all the way up to this point, has been exclusively a talker, not a doer, a role Gisborne seems to have little respect for.
Al, this show's part entertainment. It takes a lot of skill to entertain the audience while we do our projects.
Anyone can do what you do.
This moment from the first season, in which Al declares he's fed up with Tim's non-stop yakety-yak, is about as close as he ever gets to quitting. Again, since it's a sitcom, he can't ever be allowed to, but Frederick Gisborne does quit, and he allows us to see what happens when an Al and a Tim go their separate ways. Cyrus Field still has a major part to play in our story here in the 1850s. Looking far ahead, though, he's going to come out of the telegraphy business a very rich man. But this is a man who is a mover and a doer, and unlike Gisborne, his idea of moving and doing is mostly defined by moving money from one column to the next. He'll invest in everything from railroads to newspapers, and will end up being associated with the robber barons of the late 19th century, a group of aspiring monopolists intent on buying politicians, driving down wages, and generally immiserating the working class. There's debate over how involved Field actually was in any of those practices, but he is vilified for it. By the end of his life, he's mostly seen in the papers as a caricature, a crony dividing up America's wealth between him and his millionaire buddies. One of those buddies, Jay Gould, turns heel on Field, targeting him specifically and manipulating stock prices to squeeze him out of almost all his fortune. Well, says this unsympathetic writer, that's what you get. I think Field could have avoided dying next to broke if he'd done what Frederick Gisborne had done. Despite the falling out with the Atlantic Telegraph Company, he returned to Newfoundland a hero, and continued adventuring around there until a gunshot from God knows who put an end to that chapter of his life. Then he started leveraging his practical experience to become a scientist, renowned inventor, and eventually the superintendent of the Canadian Telegraph Service. Gisborne spent the rest of his life celebrated as the signature pioneer of the transatlantic telegraph in Newfoundland and the Maritimes, territories that were and are sparsely populated and typically ignored by the rest of Canada, let alone the world. His fame never extended far past there, but he doesn't seem to have ever cared, nor did he ever have the impulse to play around in the stock market and juice his wealth to incomprehensible levels. He was perfectly content to just sit his ass down somewhere and do what he liked to do. There don't seem to be any statues of either Field or Gisborne. There's a plaque dedicated to Field on a building in Manhattan next to Gramercy Park, the former site of his mansion. As far as commemorations you can actually go and visit, I think that's about all he ever got. And I think the only thing Gisborne ever got was a lake. Gisborne Lake. And man, is it a lake. It's very close to the spot where he cut the rest of his surveying team loose in 1851. I have no idea who named it after him or when they did. Almost nothing around here has changed in the nearly 175 years since. Newfoundland remains sparsely populated, especially outside St. John's, and especially once you leave the coastlines. It's miles away from even the nearest dirt road. Virtually no one ever goes here, and outside of a short-lived proposal about 25 years ago to pump water out of this lake and sell it, virtually no one ever mentions it. I looked through social channels and found a couple of people who said they went fishing there once, and that's it. I don't have any license photos I can show you. There are barely any photos at all, but accounts from the few who've been there suggest that this satellite image absolutely does not do it justice. It's described as almost artificially beautiful, a pure and unique spectacle with water so clear and still that it sometimes almost seems invisible. But that's Al. And that was Frederick Gisborne. Have you ever had a new job nightmare? Do you even know what I'm talking about? Well, a new job nightmare can happen if you take on a new project of some kind that puts you way over your skis, but they're probably most common within the first few weeks or months after starting a new job. They come during a time when you're so disoriented by your new job that you not only not know how to do it, you have no idea how to even begin to be less bad at it. You're either overthinking it by 100 miles or underthinking it by 100 miles, and you have no idea which. These anxieties manifest as nightmares in which the job is cartoonishly dumb and overcomplicated. For example, instead of emailing a report to your boss, you have to print out 53 copies and hand deliver them by unicycle to every member of the 2009 San Diego Chargers. This is that kind of nightmare made manifest in the real world. Your job is to design and manufacture a cable capable of protecting a copper wire underwater. Let's start with this sample length of 400 feet. It's the 1850s, and the technology for applying gutta-percha insulation is still pretty new. That gutta-percha must be applied evenly. You need to be careful about how you store it. If it sits in the same way for too long, the copper wire might begin to sit off center. If it sits in the sun too long, the gutta-percha could heat up and lose its shape. Now, take this 400-foot length and extend it to an entire mile. What if there's a kink somewhere? If there is, are the materials strong enough to withstand it? This is not a game of percentages. You cannot compensate for one bad foot with 1,000 good ones. An electrical charge does not care about that. It will not heroically leap across an impure stretch of cable just because you tried your best. One weak spot, if weak enough, is capable of single-handedly turning this entire cable into expensive garbage. Are you going to be able to maintain this quality throughout every last foot of this mile? You might say so, but do you know so? You'd better be absolutely sure, because these are not like the above-ground telegraph wires we're used to that we can go and repair whenever we want. This goes to the bottom of the ocean, and once it's down there, there's no repairing it. You will never see it again. Additionally, this mile of cable is going to get heavy, really heavy. In water, this mile of cable will weigh about 1,300 pounds. Above the water, it'll weigh an entire ton. Will you be able to safely load it onto a ship? Will that ship's equipment allow you to spool it out smoothly without straining or squeezing it? You're talking about an entire mile of cable weighing an entire ton? Make that 2,500 tons, because you will require 2,500 miles of cable. How are you going to manufacture all this? Where? Who? With whose money? How will you ensure that every foot of these thousands of miles is free of defects? What ship on Earth is capable of carrying all these 2,500 tons? Will you have to use multiple ships? How will that work? Will you splice lengths of this cable together out there in the middle of the ocean? How are you going to safely unload this much cable, bearing this much weight, out of the ship and onto the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, a surface that you cannot see and that no one has ever seen? And you can be sure that this is a nightmare, because you cannot win a nightmare. Even if you do somehow successfully navigate all of this, you remain at the mercy of the signal slowdown problem that has plagued every underwater cable ever laid that was even 1/10 this long, rendering them borderline worthless. We don't even understand how to fix those. To try a cable 10 times longer that will greatly magnify a problem that we still do not understand, this is lunacy. This is delusional, which in fact is the key here. Undertaking this project requires pure, bullheaded ignorance to the point of delusion. And suddenly, maybe a man like Cyrus Field is now a little bit easier to understand, even appreciate. His impulsiveness is capable of overriding all doubts and fears and compelling him to shove all his chips to the middle of the table. This is the only sort of attitude, the only sort of person who could lead a project like this one. There are, in fact, different variants of Tim. Sometimes they're oddly necessary. Like any Tim, Cyrus Field will require a supporting cast to refine his good ideas and mitigate the impact of his bad ideas. In this era, the characters you'll find within these lines of work fall into one of two categories of men. They say men here, naturally, as projects like this one can often be explained by the outright disqualification of more than a half of all human beings, and that in turn can play some part in explaining why both Tool Time and the Atlantic Telegraph Company are the way they are. Anywho, the commonly understood types here are the man of science and the practical man. Field, a total newcomer to the field of telegraphy, is neither one. A perfect example of a practical man can be found in company stakeholder Charles Bright. Bright is the boy wonder who laid the first undersea cable between Scotland and Ireland when he was just 21 years old. He has no formal scientific education, but has made up a lot of the difference through hands-on, real-world experience that has taught him a lot of things that a university could not. Another practical man on board is fellow stakeholder John Watkins Brett, known as the founder of the submarine Telegraph, who oversaw the first successful cable laid across the English Channel. The Man of Science label is reserved for someone who tends to lack hands-on experience but is well versed in the theories and principles at play. This perfectly describes William Thomson, who, in 1856, at age 31, becomes an unpaid advisor and member of the board of the Atlantic Telegraph Company. From this point forward, Thomson will serve as our transformational Al. He is a genius, and in our time, he will be recognized as such. He won't be right about everything. For example, about a year and a half before the Wright brothers' first heavier-than-air flight, he'll predict that heavier-than-air flight will never be possible, but he's among the most gifted scientists of his time and will prove to be one of the most influential scientists of all time. To tell just one story of many, at one point he'll be asked to write a series of magazine articles explaining how a mariner's compass works. He writes one article, gets annoyed over how badly designed it is, says, "Forget it, I'll just make a better one," and designs a way better one that immediately becomes the standard for decades and makes every other mariner's compass on Earth obsolete. And that's what Thomson is bringing to the table here. He has such a thorough command of scientific knowledge and is such a voracious learner that he can become one of the foremost experts in an industry he joined last month. He has this special gift for knowing where to dive deep, which questions to answer, what the problem actually is. Consequently, as John Steele Gordon notes in his book A Thread Across the Ocean, his work here will produce a domino effect that helps eventually lead to the advent of wireless radio and television. Even here and now, Thomson's findings are, transformational. He drills down on the problem that's stumping telegraphers everywhere. Why do signals come through clean on above-ground cables but get all jumbled up when sent through underwater cables? You might guess, well, water leaks through the gutta-percha and screws up the signal, which it can if the cable is of poor quality, but that's not actually the fundamental issue at play here. After a time, Thomson introduces what he calls the law of squares. Above-ground wires aren't even cables, right? They're usually just bare wires. If you shoot a current down a copper wire, that wire is basically only slowed down by the resistance of the wire itself. The amount of resistance depends on the quality and purity of the wire, but it's basically more or less linear. After X amount of time, it goes Y distance. So let's say you want to send the letter A, which in Morse code is a dot and a dash. You type the dot into the telegraph key, and an instant later, you type the dash. Since the resistance remains more or less linear throughout, they retain a comfortable cushion from one another. The person receiving them at the other end is actually going to be able to perceive this brief span of silence between the two. This span is everything. In Morse code, it's what makes the letter A the letter A. It's what makes sending literally anything possible. But undersea cable requires gutta-percha insulation. While this insulation does protect it from the water, it also acts as a capacitor that itself absorbs electricity. So the current is up against two things, not only the resistance of the wire, but also the capacitance of the surrounding insulator. This double teaming is not 1 + 1, it doesn't stack, it's not additive, it's exponential, hence the name, law of squares. So let's run this experiment again, sending the letter A, tapping a dot, and then a dash an instant later. As they travel up the line, they both slow down so much that the gap between the dot and the dash gets smaller and smaller, and by the time they actually get to you on the far end, that gap is long gone, and the dot and dash are totally smashed into each other. It's basically just a big long dash. You'd have no way of knowing that this was actually supposed to be the letter A. So how are you supposed to get around this? Well, you could send the dot and then wait a lot longer and then send the dash. That would give the person on the other end the gap they need, but depending on how long your cable is, that wait could be a solid couple of seconds. And that's just for the letter A, which only has one gap. A lot of letters require 2 or 3 gaps, plus extra longer gaps before and after the letter itself to differentiate one letter from the next. So just imagine trying to type entire sentences or paragraphs like this. Agonizing. You can probably understand now why that cable at the bottom of the Black Sea has a max transmission rate of 5 words a minute. And again, that's only 300 miles. This transatlantic cable is going to need to stretch about 1,700 nautical miles, more than 5 times as long. And the further this goes, the more this line is going to flatten out, meaning you'll wish the problem was only 5 times as bad. Stack all the other potential problems on top of this, and I mean, even if you do manage to drop a cable across the Atlantic Ocean and it still works by the time you're done with it, it might be so horrifically slow that if you want to send anything longer than a couple of sentences, you're better off just walking on a ship and sailing your ass over there to tell them yourself. Is there a fix for this? Well, there's good news. Sorta. Thomson has found that, yeah, there are ways to offset the law of squares to the extent that it won't be all that much of a problem for us. It will be expensive, though, because the universe never guaranteed that this would be cheap or easy. Thomson studies a recently manufactured length of cable that looks a lot like this. This is not necessarily identical to other undersea cables that have been laid to this point, but it's pretty close. You can go ahead and ignore this outer ring here, which is only seen at the ends of segments. The exterior of nearly this entire cable is made up of these iron wires, which, as you can see, are twisted tightly to make the cable stronger. This ring here is composed of a delicious casserole of tar, pitch, linseed oil, and wax. Inside of that is this thick coating of gutta-percha, and finally, in the middle, the copper wire. So here's a fun question for you. How thick do you think this cable is? I first learned about this cable when I was a kid, and on a purely emotional level, I just assumed it was huge, like an oil pipeline or something. I mean, it feels like it should be, right? A cable apparatus this historically transformational, that stretches this long, should be so gigantic that you couldn't even come close to wrapping your arms around it. Well, it is about this thick. About as thick as a Roosevelt dime, about 5/8 of an inch. Actually, the cable was just barely thinner than this. A transatlantic cable, again, one that's going to run 1,700 or so nautical miles. I think the word we're searching for is raggedy. Yeah, it's a big, huge transcontinental jerry-rig, which it has to be because even this cable is going to be outrageously expensive to produce a couple thousand miles of. After a considerable amount of study and experimentation, William Thomson concludes that, sorry, even this is not good enough. He makes two recommendations. First, make the copper core a lot larger so that it can offset the capacitance of the surrounding gutta-percha. Second, make sure the copper itself is of way higher quality than this cut-rate stuff they've been trying to get away with. Thomson's findings are devastating. Not only will this be way more expensive to produce than it already is, the cable he recommends will be about 4 times as heavy, which would make the already confounding logistics of loading it up on God knows how many ships a lot more complicated. It splits the Atlantic Telegraph Company in two. Its chief electrician, a Tim to be named later, who you will soon meet, is adamant that a thinner, cheaper cable like the one they use in the Black Sea is going to work just fine, and promises they'll be able to find some other workaround to make do with it. He's backed up by Samuel F.B. Morse, who, despite not being a key stakeholder, is still in the mix. I'm realizing that I didn't slot in enough room for Morse here, so I guess I'll stick him right over here. Morse uses his considerable name recognition and star power to assure the board that they can do this on the cheap. Meanwhile, Thomson is backed up by Charles Bright, who trusts Thomson's findings and agrees that going forward with this cheap cable is going to present a major liability, so major that it might single-handedly scuttle this entire project. Cyrus Field listens carefully to both arguments, and then he says, sorry, we kind of ordered all the cable already. That's dumb enough. It's about to get a lot dumber. Let's look again at this cable. These protective iron wires are twisted in a particular direction. It follows then that every single segment of this cable needs to have its iron twisted in that same direction. If not, if a segment were twisted in the opposite direction, it would all unravel and come loose, right? Anyway, since this is a rush job for the ages and manufacturing the 2,500 miles of cable Field has ordered figures to take a really long time, he's fast-tracking production by contracting 2 different manufacturers. Half the cable is manufactured in Greenwich, the other half is manufactured hundreds of miles away up in Birkenhead. You know, some of my favorite tool time goofs were the ones you were supposed to see coming from way, way off. You hear a setup like this.
I want to introduce Benford's new Miracle Glue.
Tim, you might want to remind our viewers to be careful when using this glue because it will bond instantly to your skin.
And you know, for sure, what's gonna happen.
You want to set your laminate securely on your shimmies front and back?
Just like you saw this coming. The two lengths of cable manufactured by these companies were twisted in opposite directions, which not a single person seemed to notice until they were both finished. Whoops. This is a project of enormous scale, fraught with peril and uncertainty at every turn, one that will send everybody from the board of directors to the anonymous deckhand biting their nails off in pure anxiety over all the infinite number of things that could and probably will go wrong. All the daunting problems that will require every ounce of ingenuity they can find within themselves. Making sure the wires were twisted in the same direction was the free space on the bingo card. The easy part. The only easy part. And Cyrus Westfield had so many ants in his pants that he fucked it up. And now, like Tim throughout half the remainder of the episode, he's gotta wear it. Field at least gets to wear it in a less literal fashion. In order to jerry-rig these two incompatible cables together, people way smarter than him end up having to devise this monstrosity of a coupler that's 12 feet long and weighs 300 pounds. Luckily, this will turn out to work just fine, so it won't be an issue going forward. But this cable cost a total of 225,000 pounds. Cyrus Field just came way too close to throwing half of that, 112,000 pounds, which would be about 12 million pounds or 15 million US dollars in today's money, for the dumbest possible reason. In so doing, in case there was any doubt, he has firmly established the Atlantic Telegraph Company as our Binford tools, the penny-pinching overlord that foists shoddy products on our protagonists and regularly threatens to bring down the entire thing through mismanagement and malfeasance. On one occasion, they tried to make Tim and Al promote a saw on Tool Time that Tim quickly realized was a dropship piece of junk shoved off on him by a clueless executive.
How can he not know this is a bad tool?
He's been sitting behind a desk for 10 years.
Cyrus Field has been sitting behind a desk for 10 years. Although he'd made his own way up the ladder, he's far removed from hands-on experience and has none in the business of telegraphy. He's not a practical man. He's not a man of science. Having alienated Frederick Gisborne, his Al, he is no longer even Tim. Because a Tim cannot exist without his Al. Instead, Cyrus Field has himself become Binford Tools, poised to set up successive Tims for failure. And just like Binford, which is constantly trying to offload its enormous surplus of crap, the Atlantic Telegraph Company is now the proud owner of 2,500 nautical miles worth of glorified vacuum cleaner power core that it now expects to form a bridge to a new age of humankind. They want a sensibly priced miracle. They want to fly balsa wood to the moon. All hope is not lost. There are still some in the room who are geniuses. Unfortunately, there are others who are not. You see, Cyrus Field loves himself some confirmation bias, which again is probably why he waited for William Thompson's input on the cable until it was too late. Instead, he's made a new friend, one who faithfully told him every single thing he wanted to hear. This friend's name is Wildman Whitehouse, who serves in the Atlantic Telegraph Company in the role of chief electrician. He is a man who does whatever he wants for any reason he feels like, so I will too, pronouncing his name from this point forward as Wildman, even though it's probably pronounced Wildman. Wildman Whitehouse is the most powerful and destructive Tim humankind has ever known. In the years ahead, he will commit errors that are equal parts history-altering, catastrophic, and outright cartoonish, a combination no other person, alive or dead, has ever achieved. By the time you're finished reliving his story, you might well come to the conclusion that he is the dumbest man you have ever heard of in your entire life. You're gonna love him. I sure do.